The views and opinions expressed in The Fact Is with Hollis Grant are those of Hollis Grant and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Droids Canada Network. Droids Canada Network does not take responsibility for any content or position produced by Hollis Grant and his show. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of The Fact Is. I'm your host, Hollis Grant, and on today's episode, we are going to be talking about white privilege. We've talked about white privilege before in the past, and types of privileges and all that sorts of nonsense. DroidsCanada.com is your source for all of our past episodes, almost all 75 of them. In fact, it's almost been 2 years of The Fact Is. And I'd like to take this time to say thank you very much for listening and for all the support. So, someone requested that we cover this particular topic. And why is it that we're talking about white privilege? We're talking about white privilege in 1940 in the Netherlands. Now, Anne Frank, and for those that aren't familiar with who Anne Frank is, was a German-Dutch teenage girl. And she died, unfortunately, in the Holocaust. She was killed by Nazis. And she wrote a diary. And she wrote about her experiences in youth. And while she was living in an attic, being hidden away by people in the community that did want to save these people who were just like you and I, that just happened to be Jewish, to die for their faith. Now, years ago, I've read the Diary of Anne Frank, and it took a very long time to read it. Not because it was dry and boring. A little of it is. It's a diary of a little teenage girl. I cannot relate to the diary of a teenage girl. But the reason why that it took so long to do it is because as you're reading this mundane life events that happened, or these thoughts of a teenage girl, again, that I can't relate to, you're reading them knowing that this person is going to die. This person did die. Only because they were born Jewish. And that's the most haunting part of the entire diary. Is it's just one day, it just stops. There's no more mention. It just ends. And you close the book and you realize, I closed this book and, within a few days this little girl died. I finished the book, I finished her life. And that was the chilling part of the entire experience of reading this little girl's diary. Now, it's been decades, nearly 100 years since these horrible atrocities have happened. Almost everybody that survived is all but dead. There's only a handful of World War II veterans left. In fact, there's only one World War II veteran that is a Medal of Honor recipient in America left. So as the generation dies off, we lose that connection. And that happened with World War I. And we're getting to the point now where we're losing that connection. And as we lose the connection, it just becomes text in a book. Justin Bieber years ago was in hot water by mentioning that Anne Frank would be a believer, and he received a lot of criticism, and he actually ended up going to the Anne Frank Museum in the Netherlands and made an apology regarding that. But today, we're going to be talking about the white privilege of Anne Frank, because it's been so long and it can no longer be humanized, and it's just text. Twitter has erupted over the last week with comments about Anne Frank and her white privilege. So I'm going to take from an article on Medium.com, which is the Anne Frank white privilege, kind of where it all started. And we'll sort of read through this here. Did Anne Frank have white privilege? Because one doesn't have to be alive to have it. Recently, in the month of July 2022, there was this Twitter storm concerning Anne Frank. It is argued Anne Frank has or had or does not have or never had white privilege. The situation is far more complex than it seems, and there are a lot of white people butthurt about it. And that's a quote from the article, again, on Medium.com. And a whole lot of non-whites trolling white tears. Just type in this of the situation that deserves, quote, my style of nuance. Shall we begin? Anne Frank was a German Dutch-Jewish teenage girl who was murdered in the Holocaust. She was given a diary in her youth by her father prior to her capture, and it is through her written work that we have all identified with her life and struggle. Her diary was posthumously published, being that it was never her wish to become a published writer. The first point of confusion this author wants to deconflate is where and how temporal space matters. Temporal space in this point concerns time while Anne Frank was among the living and time after death, and she has currently been dead longer than she was alive. Don't worry, we'll all meet the same fate. Dead longer than alive, we will all meet that one. I fail to see where the author in this article is making light of a situation about someone dying in a Holocaust, especially a teenage girl dying in a Holocaust. You can kind of make those dark humor jokes, on people that perhaps died in normal situations, but, the Holocaust with, teenage prepubescent women is not necessarily a great way to start off on a humor. When a person says Anne Frank had white privilege, they might be adding to the confusion. Past tense in this case refers to prior to her death, because when we reference dead people, we commonly use past tense to describe actions and behaviors while they were alive. So past tense infers while she was alive, and present tense infers while she is dead. To argue if she had white privilege while she was alive is difficult. Actually, hypothetically, yes, especially had she made it to the United States of Jim Crow. This is something completely separate. Now, Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws, it's interesting to note that Jim Crow was the minstrel that would jump around and dance, and that was the song, Jump Jim Crow. Very interesting song to go back and listen to these early songs around the 1820s and 1830s, 1840s, when American music was just beginning. Absolutely fascinating. Stephen Foster is one of the pioneers of modern music, and I highly recommend to go back and listen to some of the songs that he wrote. Now, if you're to time travel and save her 15-year-old life and bring her to the present, she'd definitely have white privilege in America of 2022. The same white privilege Natalie Portman, born to Jewish folk, has, is what the author is claiming. So sure, one can argue she had white privilege, or would have had it when she was among the living, but this is not as interesting nor precise than observing her posthumously. Now, white privilege while dead, and Frank's death, she 100% totally has white privilege. And Frank has far more sociological power dead than she ever did alive. One of those powers or enablers of that power is white privilege. Now, the author here assesses that many people are not seeing the issue correctly, and he doesn't care, or she, or they, or Z, or Zard, or whatever 150 different pronouns this individual wants to use, doesn't care if the original thread creator of the conversation was trolling. Quote, y'all can handle that on your own. The point of the lecture is an objective observation of the claim that at hand, white privilege, Anne Frank, yes or no? Anne Frank's death, she 100% totally categorically has white privilege. A lot of people are mad at the notion Anne Frank having white privilege while being chased, captured, and murdered by Nazis. That's not the right way to look at it. The bigger picture is how she's carrying after death and after her diary was published. So yes, she has white privilege because everything was published. If Anne Frank had white privilege, isn't the right question to ask. Did she benefit from it? This white privilege isn't the right question to ask either. It's an interesting question, which is why the answer deserves elaboration. The author argues that no, even though she would have if opportunity at Ellis Island presented itself. And Frank didn't personally benefit from white privilege after death, but her name and legacy does. because I guess white people want to read, or people want to read this touching story about how evil humanity can be. And in that evil situation, in those evil lands and government, that there are real people. And that's the real story of Anne Frank, is that while all this evil was going on, there are ordinary people just trying to get by and survive, and preoccupying themselves and their minds with things that are happening outside of their community, outside of the town. Because the war wasn't happening inside the town, because the Germans already occupied it. It wasn't happening inside of the Netherlands because Germany wasn't really fighting there anymore. So all of this, and you're not seeing the troops, you're only seeing a handful of police coming running around and hiding in attics. And that's where the story comes from, is you're not seeing the evil as a whole, and it's just a regular person trying to get by. And that's, again, is the real story. Now, the author says it's very possible for white privilege to be granted to people after death. He says, hell, Mormons, for example, will make dead people Mormons long after they are buried, which is a form of white privilege grant. And Mormons have done this to Anne Frank as well. In fact, white privilege is retrofitted on many dead people. It's not even funny, the author claims. White privilege is seen as how American white people live among the living, hold and defend the legacy of the dead. Christopher Columbus is claimed to have white privilege. Albert Einstein has white privilege. All these cowardly pieces of shit Confederates have white privilege, trying to change a U.S. Army-based name or take down a statue, and see what happens. The majority of these are granted posthumously. Of course, this is all nonsense. When you look at what this person is saying, is that Julius Caesar benefits from white privilege. Well, then I can just say, what about Ramses? What about all the great pharaohs that we learn about? What about the Code of Hammurabi? Possibly the foundations of Western culture and Western society comes down to Persian people. So do they have white privilege? The epic story of Agamemnon. This is the foundation of all great action-adventure stories, come from this individual, and has been repeated in history over and over again. Are we to say that Agamemnon has white privilege? When we talk about Sitting Bull, and we talk about all the great chiefs of the Lakota and Dakota nations, are they having white privilege as well, because we're speaking about them? Or when we look at other nations, and we look at all the past emperors in China, when we talk about the emperors of Japan, when we talk about all these different empires throughout the world, are we saying that they have white privilege because we're remembering their legacy and their mark that they left on the world? I understand it's an unpopular position to be talking about the American Civil War, the Union and the Confederacy. But the starting of the war didn't come down to slavery. It was never about slavery. And there's a fantastic documentary about the Civil War that was put out on PBS back in the 90s. And in fact, it was on Netflix. And it talked about the Civil War and what it was and how it started. And to say that all Confederate people are quote-unquote pieces of shit would be inaccurate. There was a lot of great generals on both sides that came out of it. When we look at General Lee and his sacrifice to what he believed in, where the state was more important than the federal government. And this is where the Confederacy started. We can get into the topic of immigration and how the immigrants would always come to the north and didn't populate the south. When we could talk about slave labor, you're not going to find anyone that's going to disagree that slavery is bad and was a very bad idea. Always was, always will, and always will be. But to suggest that all people on all sides are just bad people, just because, not necessarily the case. Because if we're going to say that there are bad people on bad sides, and we'll use the Nazis here in this case, then we'll have to throw out all the technology that was gained from all the defected German scientists and have to say goodbye to NASA's program, the rocket, as they were all developed originally by Nazis. So saying this is just complete nonsense, and the author is just trying to score cheap clickbaits. And he's going to go on and say even Jesus has white privilege. Even if fictionalized as a white man, the very act of manufacturing and maintaining a, quote, white Jesus speaks measures onto the concept of white privilege itself. The very fact that Jesus can not be worshipped by white people has been observed, as his original skin tone speaks measures in and itself, i.e. not white and considerably dark as described in the Bible. Nonsense. Christianity has nothing to do with the color of a man's skin. If you're going to ask anyone if somebody came from the Middle East, they're going to look Middle Eastern. And there's no one that really is going to say that Jesus was white. And again, it doesn't really matter, because the basis of Christianity and the tenets that come out of Christianity have nothing to do with the outwards appearance of a man, but the inside of the man is how it's measured, as in the great speech by Martin Luther King Jr. Not necessarily a great man, but he did want to judge everyone by the contents of their character. So if you're going to say that Jesus is white privilege, it shows you how nuts some of these people are that are leading these conversations and putting out articles to talk about, well, you're white, you have white privilege. It makes no sense to claim that a woman, a teenage girl, has white privilege because her story survived. And I'm sure there is a lasting legacy for the millions of people that have been slaughtered in the continent of Africa. Because if a journal was kept, these are stories that people would be maybe interested in reading as well, is to hear the lives and struggles through these horrible atrocities. The 1993 ethnic violence in Burundi, apologies. The 1996 anti-Igbo, which was a Nigerian issue, and it was estimated between 8,000 to 30,000 people had been killed. The Darfur genocide, the Darfur War, the Ixia in 1972 killings. We have the Isaka genocide, which was in between 87 to 89, the Somalis. We have the Rwandan genocide that happened in 1994, the Tutsis and the Hutsis. We have the Hollis, which was in the Congo from 96 to 97, of hundreds of thousands of people all throughout this continent that has had genocides. Just as bad, if not worse, than what happened in Europe. And if we could have some records coming out, if we could have stories to tell, the same stories would hold its weight in today's society if storytelling and record keeping was as important throughout the world. So it's not about white privilege. It's about the telling of a story. And stories and telling of stories, they have no colors. People will say that history is written by the conquerors, and Ramses III was the greatest at propaganda. History today seems to be all about losers. By taking stories that are told to inspire, to motivate, to make people feel and to turn them upside down to say, it's not worth it. These people aren't worth looking at. These people are worthless. Destroy the past and rebuild a new society. Go back and listen to our rules for radicals, because here it is. Your left-wing nut jobs wanting to tear down all civilization and all past and dismantle, just like the Russians did in 1917 and just like the Nazis did when they took power in 1939. Eliminate all the past and build a future together. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to this edition of The Fact Is. I'm your host, Hollis Grant, and you have yourself a great week.
Dan, what happens every Thursday?
That would be DCR Droids Canada Radio.
And what time is it out on Thursday?
That's from 9 till 11 p.m.
Dumb question, where do you find it?
You find that at accessradio.ca.
And what's the best part?
It's